Well, you've looked at the individual production possibility curve and the society's production possibility curve with M. Foodie. I feel like we need to go into more detail though to prepare you for the work you're going to do with this. So the production possibility curve is a model that examines the impact of limited resources on our choices. That model is based on the following assumptions. Full employment, that means that we're using all the resources available, whether it's labor or land or capital. We're using all of our resources. Productive efficiency, which means we're using those resources as efficiently as possible to produce as much as possible. Fixed resources and technology. In other words, we don't gain resources as we're collecting this information or have a technological improvement. So both of those are fixed. And we're only going to have two goods. And in this case, our goods are going to be wheat and rice. So the resources that we are looking at are these 3 acres of land. We have a dry acre, which can produce 3 bushels of wheat or 1 bushel of rice, a semi-moist acre, which can produce 2 bushels of wheat or 1 of rice, and a wet acre that can produce 1 acre of wheat or 1 acre of rice. Notice that these 3 acres are equally capable of producing rice. And that's because to produce rice, you have to have wet land. Well, you can irrigate the dry land enough to make it wet enough to produce rice. But they are not, these 3 acres are not equally capable of producing wheat, which you need dry land for. So it's very hard to dry that wet land out enough to make it as productive as the dry in producing wheat. So let's look at this question. Why can we not produce more wheat and rice? And the reason is we have limited resources. Namely, here, especially our land, but it could be water, it could be equipment, it could be labor. So let's look at the different choices or combinations of wheat and rice that can be produced out of this land. So we're going to look at first that we're not going to plant any of these acres in rice. And so that's going to leave us with the dry acre producing 3 bushels of wheat, the semi-moist producing 2 bushels of wheat, and the wet acre producing 1 bushel of wheat. So 3 plus 2 plus 1 would give us that we're going to have a total of 6 acres of wheat produced in that combination. Let's look at our next combination where we produce a little rice. Which of these 3 acres are you going to switch over to rice? Well, if you answered the wet, you're right, because you're going to produce you're going to switch over the wet acre because it has what we call the lowest opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the amount of a product, wheat in this case, that is sacrificed to produce more of another product, rice. And so the wet acre has the lowest opportunity cost because when we switch it over to producing rice, we're only going to sacrifice 1 bushel of wheat. The dry acre has the greatest opportunity cost of these 3 acres because when we switch it over to producing rice, we're no longer going to get the 3 bushels of wheat that it produces. So let's go ahead and fill out choice B. With rice, we're going to produce, with the wet acre, we're going to produce 1 bushel of rice, and we'll no longer have it producing wheat. So all we'll have left is the dry acre and the semi-moist. 3 plus 2 would give us 5 bushels of wheat would be what we have. Now let's look at the next choice where we have a little bit more rice produced. So we're going to switch another acre over to producing rice, and out of the dry and the semi-moist, the one that has the lowest opportunity cost is a semi-moist acre. So when we produce that, switch it over to producing rice, we're going to have 2 bushels of rice. And that's going to leave us only with our dry acre producing wheat. And so we'll be producing 3 bushels of wheat. And then choice D, we're going to have all 3 acres producing rice, 1 bushel each. So that would be 3 total bushels. And no acres are going to be producing wheat, and so our bushels of wheat would be down to 0. Let's draw this on a graph. We always have to do our graphs here. So here's our vertical axis, and here's our horizontal axis. Let's put rice on our vertical axis, and we're going to put 0, 1, 2, and 3. And let's put wheat over here on our horizontal axis, and don't do what I'm about to do. So this is 0, and we're just going to, for now, copy what we have here, 3, 5, and 6. Now I want you to tell me why this is wrong, how I did that. The reason, hopefully you're thinking that this is wrong, well, let me keep these here, is when we go from this point to this point in this first square, we're going to increase our bushels of wheat by 3. But when we add on this next square, we're going to go from 3 to 5 and have an increase in bushels of wheat of 2. And then when we go in our next square, it's going to show an increase in bushels of wheat of 1. That's not right. We need every square to increase by the same amount so that we get an accurate perception of the relationship between wheat and rice here. So each square in all these graphs need to increase by the same amount. So I'm going to increase each square by 1 here. Now we don't always have to increase each square by 1. We could increase each square by 2. So it would be 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. So as long as each square increases by the same amount, it's good. Now let's plot our points that we have over here, or our choices. So if we have 0 rice, we're going to have 6 wheat. So that would be right here. If we have 1 rice, which is right here, we're going to have 5 wheat. So those two would come together right here. So this was A, this is B. C is 2 rice and 3 wheat. So there's C. And then D is 3 rice and 0 wheat. So if we connect the dots here, this is our production possibilities curve. The production possibilities curve is the most we can produce with the resources that we have. And the only difference between A and C is that if we're at point A, society would prefer all wheat. But at point C, they're going to prefer some rice with that wheat. So the only difference between any point on this line is the combination of wheat and rice that society wants to produce. Every point on this line, we're producing as much as we can with the resources that we have. Let's go look at this question here. What is the opportunity cost of the first bushel of rice? Now, so we can see this on our graph or on the table, and I think it's really kind of easier to see on the table. So for when we have our first bushel of rice, we are sacrificing 1 bushel of wheat. Of our second bushel of rice, which is what we get when we go from B to C. So our second bushel of rice is increasing by 1 there. We're giving up 2 bushels of wheat. And then our third bushel of rice, when we go from C to D, we're giving up 3 bushels of wheat. This is showing us what we call the law of increasing opportunity cost. And that is where, I'm trying to get this there it's straight. That is where, there we go. Sorry. That is where, as the production of a good increases, the opportunity cost of producing an additional unit increases. So it asks us here to explain why this happens. It happens because these acres are not equally capable of producing wheat. What that means in English is that the dry acre can produce 3 bushels of wheat. The wet acre can't produce that much. It can only produce 1. Therefore, when increasing production of rice, we switch the worst wheat producing acre to rice first, because we're only giving up 1 bushel of wheat when we do that, and switch the best wheat producing acre to rice last, because we have to give up a much greater amount of wheat when we switch that dry acre over, 3 bushels, than when we switch the wet acre over. Okay, let's look at some other things with this. So here's our graph again. You are at point C, deciding whether or not to produce 1 more bushel of rice. So here we are at point C, deciding whether or not to produce 1 more bushel of rice. Compare the marginal benefit and marginal cost of producing 1 more bushel of rice. So if we're at point C, to produce more rice, we would be going from 2 bushels up to 3, or going to up this curve to point D. And when we do that, our benefit of that is 1 additional bushel of rice. But when we go from C to D, we're going to have a cost of producing 3 less bushels of wheat. So what society has to do is they have to decide, is the benefit or utility we get from this additional bushel of rice greater than the benefit or utility that we get from these 3 bushels of wheat combined? If it is, yeah, then we need to move and produce that additional bushel of rice and have less wheat. If it's not, we stay where we are. Okay, let's look at it another way. You're at point C and deciding whether or not to produce more bushels of wheat. Compare the marginal benefit and marginal cost. So here we are at point C. We're thinking about producing 2 more bushels of wheat, so we'd be going from C to B, and the benefit would be 2 bushels of wheat. And what we're going to give up when we go from C to B is we're going to, instead of having 2 bushels of wheat, we're going to have of rice. We're going to have 1 bushel of rice. So our cost is going to be 1 bushel of rice. So notice that this marginal cost and opportunity cost are the same thing. We're looking at it in different applications. So what this move is going to depend on is which one is greater, the benefit of the 2 bushels of wheat or the cost of the 1 bushel of rice. Next, we have graph the point where 2 bushels of rice and 2 bushels of wheat are produced. What could you conclude about the use of available resources? So here's 2 bushels of rice. Here's 2 bushels of wheat. That's the point where that is. So notice that it's below the production possibilities curve. So we are capable of producing more rice or more wheat or more of both. So that means that point is inefficient. And the reason that it's inefficient is that we have unemployment. Now, I guess I could put because of unemployment of resources, or maybe we're not using all of our acres, maybe we aren't using all of our labor, or inefficient use of resources. So we aren't using them to produce as much as we can. We're not using them as well as we can. Okay, this next thing says, well, graph the point where we have 3 bushels of rice and 4 bushels of wheat. So it'd be right here. I'm going to label this point H. So we can't produce at this level. Remember, we can, with the resources we have, we can only go up to this curve. So in order to produce at H, something has to happen to shift this whole production possibility curve out to the right. And when we move to the right, we're always increasing. So at H, cannot produce with current resources. So we cannot produce at H with current resources. What has to happen to be able to produce at H is we have to have what we call economic growth. Economic growth is just that we're producing more goods and services than we did before. So to have economic growth, one of 3 things need to happen. We need to have either more resources, so that could be more land, more labor, more water, better resources, and that could be better trained or better skilled workers that can produce more, because better skilled workers can hopefully figure out how to do everything better, or better technology. So some kind of technological improvement, such as a new designer a tractor that harvests more efficiently. So let's look at what happens in certain circumstances. What if there was an increase in technology to make rice? Something happened and made it so that we could produce more rice. Maybe we could harvest it better with this new technology. What would our production possibility curve look like? So let's say this is what it looked like before. What it would look like with a technological advancement in producing rice is it would shoot up on the rice axis but not change on the wheat axis. So this here would be our new production possibility curve. What would happen if we had depletion of the world's resources of land to produce wheat? And so we would be able to produce less wheat than before, but the amount of rice we could produce would be about the same. So our production possibility curve would shift in on the wheat axis. Let's say that we're producing right here. We'll call this point B. And there's an increase in demand for rice. People are wanting to eat more rice than before. Well, the production possibility curve only shifts or only changes when there's been a change in resources, an increase or decrease in resources. There's been a change in the quality of resources, maybe better resources than we had before, or there's been a change in technology. So this curve does not change. What does happen when there's an increase in demand for rice is we move up the curve where we have a higher amount of rice in our combination of rice and wheat that we produce. And then let's look here. Where do you think we should put a dot to show a recession? Remember, a recession is when we're producing less goods and services and we're laying people off and a lot of people don't have jobs. Well, that would be somewhere below here. Anywhere below this curve would show a recession, that we're not using all of our resources efficiently. Okay, let's do one other one. Here's our curve. Say this is rice and this is wheat. What do you think it looked like? How do you think this curve changed maybe when we have war or we have an earthquake and a lot of equipment and buildings are destroyed? Well, what would happen is the whole curve would shift to your left because you'd have less capital to produce with. Let's look at these two economies. We have Presentville and Futureville. And in Presentville, it produces from here to here, goods for the present. And so goods for the present would be things like food and services that are used up and gone after they're used. And then it produces from here to here goods for the future. And these goods for the future are also called capital goods. Remember, man-made things used in production. So that would be equipment and factories and things like that. And then over here we have Futureville, which is producing from here, from here to here, more capital or goods for the future, and only from here to here, goods for the present. Usually, in most years, we have economic growth. We produce more that year than we did the previous year. So we're going to assume that both these countries have economic growth. Which one do you think will have more economic growth? Well, if you said Futureville, you're right. So its curve is going to shift way out here, while Presentville's will probably only shift to right here. And the reason why Futureville is going to have a lot more economic growth is it's going to have more capital resources in the future and therefore be able to produce more. Well, I hope this helps you. And please contact me if you have questions, if I can give you some clarification. And thank you for listening.